Action.
Well, the relationship between religion and language in Quebec, or previous to the Quiet Revolution, the French Canada, proves one of the pivotal points in its history, for good cause. The clerical intelligentsia, literati, cultural figures, not least of whom included Louis Adolphe Paquet, one of the major thinkers, articulated the notion, supported by others, clerics such as Lionel Groux, that the faith is the guardian of the language, or the flip side, that language is the guardian of the faith. Why did they do this? Well, they came to the conclusion, and this they brought to the public through their speeches, through their publications, that they very closely followed the rates of assimilation. And they believed that to the extent people lost the French language, the next step meant losing their Roman Catholic faith. So it proved imperative to retain the language in order to preserve the faith. And this, to all intents and purposes, created a synergy between language and faith. And it's called, in the literature of the times, la survivance, survival. How could they survive as a people and as a community of faith, a faith community, without the French language? The implication meant that they sacralized the French language, because the priest, the clerics, and indeed several of the clergy bought into the idea that when people no longer spoke French, they thereafter would leave the parish, leave the church, leave the faith. And in the literature of the day, it's particularly interesting how they made the connection between no longer speaking French and apostatization. That is to say, they were no longer members of the faithful, of the true church. And so much of the literature, including that of Louis Adolphe Paquet, who was referred to as the theologian of the nation, or the national theologian. And how ironic that a clergy person who was quite well trained, had doctorates from Rome in theology, would be referred to as the theologian of the nation, or the national theologian. What an ironic combination between theology and nationalism. So we're here at an interstice in the history of French-Canadian society and that relationship between religion and language. It's no wonder, therefore, that the French language became a sacred cow, because it was considered the first line of defense in maintaining the faith, in preserving Roman Catholicism, in holding on to the Roman Catholic Church. And they would point again and again, not without reason, to what happened to Francophones outside of Quebec, whether in Ontario or in Manitoba or in Saskatchewan. And it's in that vein that they sent, to all intents and purposes, missionaries, even to Gravelbourg, Saskatchewan. They sent a cleric who became the first bishop of Gravelbourg, Saskatchewan, and we're way west in the prairies, and his name was Rodrigue Villeneuve. He was sent there so that they would keep their faith and keep their language. And it was this wedding, this synthesis between faith and language that became the cornerstone of the nationalism that propagated by people like Lionel Groux. And we see that vestigially, what this meant is that there was a continuing emphasis on the French language as sacred, as spiritual, as the language of faith, if not the language of God. And this had a further effect as we moved into the Quiet Revolution. Then a divorce began, a dichotomization between the Roman Catholic faith, because many of the secularists, if not atheists or agnostics, during the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s said, we're prepared to modernize Quebec and to bring Quebec up to date. And in doing so, we're going to jettison the old, the dusty, the doctrinal, the dogmatic, the out-of-date Roman Catholicism to which French Canada had shackled itself for so long. So they freed themselves of the shackles, the chains of Catholicism. That's how many of them perceived it. But those such as Lionel Groulx, who lived long enough, keeping in mind that he was born in 1878, so this is the time of Queen Victoria, the Empress of India, and he lives the first quarter of his life, he lives under the reign of Victoria and British imperialism. And he's very cognizant of the WASP agenda to convert those in Canada to the British ideal. Now, part of the difficulty for the Roman Catholic Church, and particularly for the episcopacy, is that yes, the French Canadians were virtually homogeneously Roman Catholic, but Canada, as a country of immigrants and as part of the British Empire, received people from the four corners of the British Empire, not least from Ireland, who were homogeneously Roman Catholic as well. And this led to some bitter battles between Francophone Roman Catholics and Irish Roman Catholics, because the Irish Roman Catholics believed we have no necessity of speaking French. We're perfectly 100% Roman Catholic without the French language. This threw up a challenge to the paradigm, because through the clerics such as Louis-Adolphe Paquette and Lionel Groulx, they had built up a paradigm that the French language and the Roman Catholic faith go hand in hand. It's a marriage made in heaven. And and of course divorce is a mortal sin in Roman Catholicism. If you divorce the French language and Roman Catholicism, you have spelled the death knell of the Catholic Church in French Canadian society and in Quebec. Lionel Groulx, born in 1878, lives all the way to 1967 in the heart of the Quiet Revolution. So he's an unparalleled historical witness. Between the two world wars, he was one of, if not the foremost, one of the foremost figures and historians. He occupied the first chair of history at the Université de Montréal. And when he sees what's happening in the Quiet Revolution, as the intelligentsia, the literati, and the cultural figures began to shed Roman Catholicism to free themselves of its shackles, of this conservative, antiquated, religious, rigorous view of the world, he writes books in dialogue with the Quiet Revolution. One of them is entitled The Paths of the Future. It's one of his last books, and he argues in Chemin de l'Avenir, Paths of the Future, that the way Quebec is headed in the midst of the Quiet Revolution, if they divest themselves of Roman Catholicism, all they're left with is the French language, and they will not have the necessary cultural critical mass to survive, because Roman Catholicism is not just religion. It's a worldview. It's an entire way of seeing the world with values and with principles. And he announces in Chemin de l'Avenir, Paths of the Future, that if Quebec continues down this path, that to all intents and purposes, they will be French-speaking Americans. And there will be no difference between Quebecers and Americans except the language. And language, he considered Roman Catholicism to be a pillar, the very cornerstone of Quebec culture and society. And if you remove that cornerstone, the whole house of cards would fall to pieces. Now you can see they're coming. You can hear them. And now